Today is Tuesday, July 16th, 2024. I'd like to call this special town meeting to order. Mr. Clerk, is there a call for the meeting?
I make a motion to skip the call.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor? Opposed? Abstaining? Passes. At this point, I turn the meeting over to Public Works Director Jim Rollins.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tonight is a special information town meeting regarding the lead service line inventory and a referendum for this inventory. So, why we're here tonight. Winston Water Works is required by the United States Environmental Protection Agency as well as the Connecticut Department of Public Health to inventory and subsequently remove all lead service lines within the system. And because of that, Winston Water Works has applied to the Department of Public Health through their Drinking Water State Revolving Fund to borrow the $450,000 cost of the inventory project. And if you notice, I have inventory highlighted. That's because this is a multi-phase, maybe a multi-phase project. The first task is to inventory all the service lines. The second part of the mandate is to remove and replace any lead service lines that are found. So that's why that $450,000 is really for the inventory only, and I wanted to exaggerate that point. So the Department of Public Health has approved our borrowing request and notified us that we're eligible for a subsidy or a grant of up to 75% of the project cost. So that's a big deal. And if you pay attention to that 75% project cost, that's going to appear in our decision-making process further down the line. So we're going to go through just kind of an executive summary. We're going to discuss what the service line is and some details about it. We're going to talk about the project itself. We're going to talk about the options of paying for this project. And at the end are a bunch of frequently asked questions, just a Q&A that people can use online. This presentation is online already, and it might spur some questions from anybody that's in the audience. So with that, the executive summary. In 2021, the United States Environmental Protection Agency established rules that said every water system in the country has to have an inventory prepared by October of 2024. Tall order, that's thousands and thousands of water companies around the country. The Connecticut Department of Public Health realized there's a need for funding these, and they announced in 2023 that they would offer state revolving fund monies for this. We applied, and in October of 2023, we were notified, as I said earlier, that we were eligible for funding, to borrow through the revolving fund and receive up to a 75%, forgiveness on that loan. So knowing that, we solicited a request for qualifications for a firm to assist us with this project, and we expect to award the project to a company called H2M. It's an engineering firm out of Windsor, Connecticut. So some of the basics of a service line. Whether you have a home or a business, most structures in this town are connected to the water mains out in the street. So the service line is basically the line that goes from the water main to the water meter in the building. And that can be anywhere from 50 or 100 feet to who knows how much. But typically they're around 100 feet or so. And the service line itself is made up of several components that are going to be inventoried. And I can just quickly fast forward. This is like 1/3 of the columns in that inventory. And there's like 50 columns altogether. So one of the things they look at is the connection where the water service reaches the water main. Then they look at what's known as the gooseneck. That's what's connected to the connector and just forms a nice curvature back out and joins the service line. Then you have a section of service line, and you have a curb stop. This is typically right about at the property boundary, and that's where the city has the ability to turn the water on and off. Then the second half of the service line runs from the curb stop all the way in to the water meter at the house. So we've got to look and assess these aspects of the service line and get an inventory of what their materials are. So in Winsted, as is typical in most communities, Winsted Waterworks actually owns and is responsible for the maintenance of the water mains, the corporation, the connector, the gooseneck, the water service out to the property line, and the curb stop. And then the service line from the curb stop into the house is the responsibility and ownership of the building, the house, the business, the institution, whatever. So those service lines can be made of many materials. By far the most common in our system is the copper. Obvious copper, looks like the color of a penny. There are not many plastic. We know of maybe a handful. We have found some lead service lines in the past. We've changed a ton of them in the past, but we don't believe there's many left. You can also have the galvanized steel pipes, and there's also a possibility of black iron, brass, black or blue plastic. Even though they're looking for lead service lines in this inventory, we're required to document exactly what's there, no matter what the material. So there's a lot to look at, and sometimes it can be a little tricky. Galvanized could look very much like lead. Copper could very much look like brass. So you got to pay attention to what you're doing. So service line history in Winsted, according to the federal lead plumbing ban, Winsted Waterworks adopted a program of no lead used in our system since 1986. And that number is going to be relevant a little later on as well. The original lead copper rule was enacted by EPA back in the 1990s. And then because of the lead copper rule, Winsted Waterworks is required to enact a sampling plan to determine if and where we had high concentrations of lead anywhere in our system. And we have always tested outstanding. Our test results are and have, as far as I know, always been well below the levels that the Department of Public Health deems unsafe. So we're in a pretty good position, and that's because in the past we did do a service line replacement program. That was roughly the 1990s, and we replaced almost every known lead service line, anything that we knew of. The key here and why it's bold is because it was not documented. We did the work, it was done. Our test results, are a pretty good indicator that it was done properly. But any records either were not kept or have been lost to time. And this lead service line inventory is essentially a record of what was done. So now we've got to backpedal and fill out the inventory based on what we believe was done, what we know was done, and what we don't know was done. So we've got to, so we had a lead service line replacement program, and it did a lot of service replacements. And then anytime we did water main replacements or fixed anything in the streets, if we ever came across a lead service line, we replaced it. Again, we should have documented it, but nobody was doing it back then. The Crystal Lake Treatment Plant also operates a corrosion control system, which keeps the pH pretty neutral so that it doesn't pull lead and other metals from the pipes. So, we've done a pretty good job, far better than, a lot of the towns or cities you hear about, like Flint, Michigan, where there's just a huge problem. And Flint, Michigan is really what catapulted this to the center of the universe for the EPA. So we've done a good job so far, but this current effort by EPA and DPH is directed at getting rid of the last lead service lines in every system in the country. So that's their goal, and obviously is to protect public health. So how do we do this? We'll get into the project details. How do you actually inventory all this stuff that's buried in the ground, below the streets, in people's basements, in the bottoms of schools, wherever these items happen to be. So Winston Water Works and our consultants will work together along with water customers to gather all the data required to fill out the spreadsheet. And like I said before, we've got 2,575 water services, and there's about 50 columns of data that need to be considered, if not filled out, for every one of those services. So this is a massive undertaking. Some of the information that they're going after is, the address of each location, GPS coordinates. You've got to come up with a unique site identification number. Water meters numbers have to be incorporated into that. Where the meter is located in the building. The material type and diameter of pipes coming in. And they want to know who is verifying this information, when they verified it, if we found something that wasn't up to snuff, what's the date of replacement, what kind of plumbing is in the building, and is it a sample site? Meaning, do you sample for one of the many samples that we take on an ongoing basis? And we touch on that in a later slide. So all of those, 15 or so, dozen or so pieces of information have to be gathered from 3 different locations on the service line. The section that goes from the curb stop out to the main, the section from the curb stop back to the house, and then inside, by the meter. So how do we gather this information? So customers may be contacted by mail. We'll send out like postcard mailers. There'll be a social media outreach. Some people can do in-home inspections for the stuff outside, or they can even have us come and do in-home visits to do that for them. And again, I showed you this spreadsheet. This goes on. This is maybe 1/3 of it. There's more columns. Twice as many columns off to the right, and then there's 25 rows down that need to all be filled out. It's a lot of information. So they're looking at. What is this not? Is it the angle? Anyway, they start off in the red boxes up top. What's your initial expectation of what you think is there? Then you're required to do somewhat random sampling of things you believe to determine if your assessment is statistically correct and if it can be counted on. Then you've got to verify it. They've got to know who's verifying it, when they verified it, and what they verified. And then, if you changed it, what did you put in, when did you put it in, who put it in, and it just goes on and on and on. It's just really a giant paper trail. So for a typical service line assessment, the first place we start, and we've already started this, we send some of our records from tax assessor's office, the building department, looking for any projects, any post-1986 dates, because that's when lead was not allowed to be used anymore. So we can eliminate those from the search. Then we go through the water department service records, which frequently have a lot of the required data, if not all of it. After that, we're going to offer customer self-evaluations, and we can, we'll give out flyers so people can understand how to do it themselves. And any one of those that people do on their own is certainly a time and money saver for the water department, i.e. for themselves. And then waterworks consultants and employees may, come in and conduct an in-building survey. That could just be looking at the pipes. If we can't get access to, the pipe that runs out to the street, you can actually, push a swab down, which checks to see if there's any, if it drags in any lead off the pipes. And then lastly, just because it's very time-consuming and expensive, we can dig holes right at the curb stops and get a look at the pipe that's going towards the main, the pipe that's going towards the house. And between all of that, we've got to put together a picture of what we've got that statistically shows, to the powers that be, that we've located and identified, all the materials in these service lines. So it's a pretty time-consuming and daunting task. So being time-consuming and daunting similarly turns into expensive. So the cost estimate that we got when we went out to request for qualifications came in, I think it was like $431. So we're asking to borrow the $450,000 cost from the State Department of Public Health's Drinking Water Revolving Fund, and we'll get into what that is here shortly. But we have other options. Our first thing you can do is you can just pay for it out of fund balance, out of savings, out of money that we have in the account. The only issue with that is you're paying all $450,000 of it. You're paying all of it in about a year, and that depletes your fund balance, so you're not able to react to emergency expenditures. We could just assess a one-time customer fee of $175 per customer, or spread that out over 4 quarters for a year, or we could borrow the funds. And of course, nobody likes borrowing. So I looked at the 2 borrowing options that would be the most likely. If we borrowed $450,000 just from a typical bank, assume we could get a 5% interest for 20 years. With interest, we'd be paying back about $35,650 a year, which is only $13.85 per customer per year, or $3.45 per customer per billing cycle. But over the cost of 20 years, that's over $700,000 for a $450,000 project. So, not ideal. So then, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund is a really, really useful and interesting organization. The state gets money and offers it to, water companies for all kinds of projects. We use the state revolving fund when we put in our building the 2 water tanks, and when we do water main projects. And so the money that we pay back into the system for the money that we borrow, they in turn lend back out to other communities, and then what they pay back gets lent back to us. They keep putting a little more in each year, and it's a very modest interest rate, typically around 2%. Now, with the state revolving fund, this is of critical importance. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund offers up some kind of a forgiveness of the total loan. And in our case, we qualified for up to 75% forgiveness. So that's just a huge benefit. And they do this because it's very important for them to get these lead lines out of there, and they want to fund it. This is kind of the opposite of the unfunded mandate. So if we borrow $450,000 and we get forgiveness of up to $337,500, that means we only have to pay back $112,500 at 2% over 20 years, which is a very modest, expense to us. So we keep talking about a forgiveness of up to 75%. So in my math, just to make it easier, I didn't assume the maximum. I assumed we're only going to get 65. We typically are much closer to the maximum, but we never want to oversell. So if we only got a 65% forgiveness, that would be, we'd be repaying about $10,000 a year for 20 years, which is $200,000, which comes out to, less than $4 a year. It's only 98 cents per quarter per customer. The rates that we currently have will absorb that, effortlessly. It's very easy. We currently have about $306,000 of debt payments budgeted into our system. And that is only for the last three projects we've done. The water main project that we recently completed, and then the 2 new water tanks that are under construction. When those are all said and done, and we're making payments on them, that will be about $306,000 a year. That was paid for by debt that we had retired from, I think it was when we did some water main projects and maybe the Crystal Lake plant. So this is a very modest amount of debt for such a huge capital-intensive entity as Winsted Water Works. So by adding this, $450,000 debt service, which is actually more like, 100 and something thousand, it would really only add about $1 to each quarter, billing cycle. Very, very, very inexpensive, and it would just get absorbed with current rates, so no rate increase would be, required. So that's the nuts and bolts of why we're here, what we're looking for, what the project is. There are some questions and answers that come later. But what's the next step? So yeah, this all sounds, pretty reasonable. What's the next step? Well, the next step is we have to get the town's permission, the citizens' permission to borrow this money. And the reason for that is because we are using, it's not Waterworks money that we're, or reputation. We can't borrow on our own. We're a town entity, so we have to borrow through the town. So the town has to approve any borrowing. So in order to do that, we have a referendum that is intended to be on Tuesday, July 23rd. That is, what, a week from now? And that will be a vote here at Town Hall from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So that's the next step for us. So this presentation was really intended to be up online as it is. It's right on the front page of the website, so anyone can go back and look at it. So I put in a bunch of frequently asked questions that I think would come to mind for anybody that's thinking about this. And we can either go through it, or we can take questions from the audience if anybody has anything in particular. Anything we want first?
I'll see your questions.
Okay, fair enough. So the request is to see the questions first. So what is Winsted Water Works? So Winsted Water Works is an enterprise fund responsible for the operation of the water and sewer departments. It's overseen by the Water and Sewer Commission. Those commission members are John Massicati, Joe Lemlin, George Clausen, Mike Farrell, and David Pines. Our Board of Selectmen liaison is Bill Hester. The commission's annual operating budget is about $4.9 million, with 2.5 being sewer and 2.4 being water. What's the history of the waterworks? Well, our waterworks is one of the oldest in the state. It was established in June of 1860 and went into operation in November of 1862. And an interesting little fact about it is that it was originally established just to provide water power for the factories and fire protection. And then once people saw high pressure water being pushed through pipes, they soon began to put indoor plumbing in, and now you have a water system. And once people started consuming it, then we had to start monitoring it and taking, being concerned with water quality. The town of Winchester took over Winsted Water Works in 1915 when it merged with the borough of Winsted, the whole Winsted-Winchester thing. So kind of a little bit of interesting history. So how big is Waterworks? So the water department has 2 reservoirs, 1,300 acres of watershed property, 1 drinking water treatment plant, 40 miles of water mains, 3 pressure booster stations, 2 pressure reducing valves, 190 fire hydrants, and 2,575 water services and meters. On the sewer side, and I'm only mentioning this because it's just interesting fact, so there's 2,800 service laterals, 40 miles of sewer mains, 9 pump stations, 300 Highland Lake sewer grinder pumps, and a wastewater treatment plant, among other amenities. So getting back to, the whole thing's about service line inventories. So what is a service inventory? It's basically that giant spreadsheet, 50 columns wide by 2,575 rows deep. And all that information needs to be documented and submitted to the Department of Public Health. So why conduct a service line? Well, we kind of talked about that. It's required by EPA and DPH. And because it's required, we are going to spend this $450,000 to do this service line inventory. The question is, how do we pay for it? Do we pay for it cash, $450,000 cash, or do we borrow it and get 75% forgiveness and only have to pay back 25% over time? I think the answer is pretty clear to most people that are looking at that. So why do we need to borrow the money? Usually it's for large infrastructure projects that you just can't fund out of your operating budgets. Like the Crystal Lake Treatment Plant, that was a huge one. The water tanks were $2 million apiece. The water lines, project was another $2 million. So those are a lot for a $4 million or a $2.5 million budget to carry on an annual basis. So you borrow it over time, and unlike a lot of borrowing, water borrowing is really a super value. We have pipes in the ground that are over 100 years old, and the pipes we put in the ground are expected to last far, far, far longer than the time it takes to pay it back. So this is really, really a good investment. So the last time we borrowed was for the water tanks and the water mains, and we borrowed a grand total of $6.35 million. We were eligible for up to a 50% forgiveness, and we rolled in at about 46% when things were all said and done, based on current prices. And we're paying that debt back at $300,000 a year until 2041. So, does it make sense to borrow for this project? Depending on how we borrow, I think it does. If we just borrowed at 5% for 20 years and paid back $700,000, unless you had to do it, I don't think it's a good way to do it. Borrowing through the state revolving fund is the only way we can take advantage of the loan forgiveness of up to 75%. Again, to me, I consider it a no-brainer. And then that last 25%, it allows us to spread that cost out over time rather than pay it right up front. I actually did look into, we asked the DWSRF people if we could go through the process and pay it off early, and they said no. This is a structured loan. This is how the system works. That way we have a revenue stream we can count on over time to loan to other people. So this program is in it for the long haul. So what is the source of the borrow funds? The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which it's a revolving fund that just is low interest loans to water systems to preserve drinking water resources. It's really that simple. What are the terms? Well, it's 20 years at roughly 2%. And that interest rate is subject to change, but it seems to be really, really darn consistent. And then how will this be repaid? Well, I touched on this earlier. Removing lead from water systems is the top priority for EPA and DPH. Therefore, they are willing to put their money in to help us get there, and that's the 50% subsidy that is a guarantee. Because Winchester is a distressed community, we get an additional up to 25% subsidy. That's where the 75% comes into play. And then out of our just regular water rents that we generally collect, we will end up paying off the rest of the loan over time just out of our operating budget. How much will the rates increase because of this debt service? You know, we've touched on that. No rate increase. Our current rates can easily handle this capital improvement project. Now, just below this I have in red, if we find a significant service line replacement program is needed, like we find a lot of service lines or we run into something that is, you know, really challenging, then yes, we're gonna have to borrow money to do that work. But this is not covering that. If we need more money for that project, we have to come back in front of the public again and ask to borrow the money. So other future significant capital improvements will also require borrowing, and we'd have to come back and ask for borrowing for that. So this is really just for one project, and it's not gonna impact the rates at all. So if it's not gonna impact the rates, you know, a lot of people are asking, why does it matter to me? Why should we use the full faith and credit of the town to repay this loan if, you know, if it's just not a big deal? Well, because we're using the full faith and credit of the town, we need the public's approval to do so. The other aspect is, if you want to build your town, you know, one of the main things that, you know, benefits everybody is a good clean water source, especially if developers are coming to your community. They always look at water and wastewater resources before making any significant investment decisions. You know, and a vibrant downtown, an industrial park, which you really couldn't have without, you know, a municipal water system and wastewater system. You know, so investing in this is really good for all of us, which is why all of us get an input into it. So we talked a little earlier about, you know, having, you know, lead in the system and testing for lead. We do a lot of water testing. That's just required by the Department of Public Health. We do daily samples up at Crystal Lake Treatment Plant. We do weekly samples that we send out to an independent lab. Crystal Lake also monitors, you know, the chemistry 24 hours a day, and there's alarms to alert us if anything goes, you know, runs amok. And we have 16 distribution locations, you know, different sample points out in the system that are tested monthly and sent out. And then we also do random samples just throughout the system, and that enables us to understand exactly, you know, do we need to flush more water, or, you know, is the pH right, is the chlorine level, you know, too high, too low, and then we make adjustments in the treatment plant. So there's a lot going on to deliver the water that comes to your tap. If there is a water quality issue, typically, you know, a customer will call Winston Water Works, and we'll get a utility man out to investigate the problem. If it's a water quality question, we can conduct sampling. We can sample it ourselves, we can test it ourselves, or we can send it out, depending on what level of test is required. So we try to get on those things right away. So what other, this is a question that came to me kind of at the end. What other long-term water projects is the Water and Sewer Commission contemplating? There's really 5 things that are what I would consider significant capital improvements. We've got about 5 miles, 12% of the system that still has kind of the old-fashioned, just raw cast iron water mains. They tend to rust on the inside, and that's why when we flush, we get dirty water complaints. So we would like to either line or replace those over time. There are some repairs to the dams, dikes, and canals. That's going to be a pretty expensive project, up in the several $million amount. The existing tank at Crystal Lake Storage, up at Crystal Lake, needs a little bit of improvements, which is one of the reasons we're building the new one. But we want to rehab the old one for, you know, storage reasons. We want to add a pressure-reducing valve to the North Main Street area, and of course, a lead service line replacement program, should one be significant enough to need funding. So I just put this up here so everybody has a feel for, okay, we're already spending $300,000 a year, you know, and that replaced debt that we had already paid off. So we're in a good position now, but coming up, we have more, which makes borrowing this money and paying back only 25% of the borrowing more important than if we had just gobs and gobs of money. Again, what's the next step? This is the same slide, just repeated. You know, we need to go to referendum to approve the borrowing, and that referendum date, you know, we're intending to set on July 23rd at Town Hall, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So if there's any specific questions that I didn't cover in the Q&A, you know, bring them on.
Jim, the money that you're borrowing, is it all going to the contracting firm? You mentioned that you're putting a bid out to a contractor, or does some of that money go into the water department's maintenance schedule, work that's gonna be necessary, just to separate what's going to the contracting, the firm that you're contracting with?
The contract, the firm that we are contracting with, their price was about $431,000, I believe. Subject to change based on what we find, because it's kind of a, you know, a unit price, you know, thing for what they expect to find. So the vast majority will be going directly to the contractor. Waterworks staff will supplement their actions and either help reduce that price or, you know, keep it from going over, depending on what we find. There's like you can imagine, there's a lot of unknowns.
So the testing that you're doing does not necessarily require digging up unless you, as you mentioned, there's some possibility once in a while digging what you call holes to check. That kind of cost, is that still included in the project cost?
Yes, it's included to the amount that we believe we're gonna need, and that's based on the firm's expectations from having done other inventories like this. And it correlates pretty closely. We had two vendors that we really looked closely at, and their numbers agreed pretty closely. So based on the age of our system, you know, the location of the system, most of it has to do with how many records we're able to find and not find. If our records are worse than we expected, we'll have more test holes, more potholing. If they're better than we expected, we'll have less. You know, we gave them a representative sample of what we had so that they could come up with an accurate projection. Now, there's a deadline for this program of October 2024, which is really a submission deadline. There's never a deadline to the actual work being done. You can submit your inventory with unknowns, but that triggers a lot more work later. The more you can knock out and prove are not lead, the more cost effective it is. So this project, even though it may not finish by October, we'll submit in October, and we'll keep on working until that money is exhausted or we've completed the job and have, you know, a complete understanding of what we have. So it's kind of a shot in the dark, but the vast majority of those funds will go to the contractor.
What's your expectation of completion?
So substantial completion, I would guess, based on the records, my hunch is we'll have probably half of the information we'd like to have by October. We submit that, it takes the powers that be time to evaluate it, and we just keep going. So in a year from now, I think we should have a really, really good feel for things. But, you know, having said that, this never ends. If you ever find a service line you didn't even know existed, and they pop up from time to time, you'll find a leaky line somewhere that no one knew was connected. Well, it may not be connected to a house, but it came off of a main where a house used to be, and it starts leaking. So you find these things, and so this inventory will never stop, you know, as long as this is a perpetual, nonstop update.
When you find these lead pipes right now, you're replacing them under your own budget.
Correct, yep.
Okay. And if they were found under
There's, we don't, we've got our hands full right now with the lead service line inventory. That's taken up a lot of bandwidth. And we got 2 tanks being built. That's enough for us to be on right now. I'm not worried about the dam. It's just that the sooner you get it fixed, the less water you lose, through leakage, the less it deteriorates. It's not like a crisis kind of a situation, but it's one that has to be addressed eventually. But it's not in the immediate horizon, no.
There's no health issue or safety issue, security issue with the dam?
No, so we get the dams, all the dams in town, including the reservoirs, inspected on an annual, different dams, I think it's every 2 years to every 5 years, depending on the hazard classification. And I think Crystal Lake, I think, is every 5 years, and they do all the dams. Then they do the dams and the dikes at Rugbrook. I want to say that is every 5 years. Highland Lake, which is not a reservoir, but they do that every 2 years. So we get updates with maintenance recommendations, and then, so it's constantly ongoing. There's all kinds of emergency plans in case there ever is a problem. Emergency management department has that, so it's not something that's just ignored.
And the typical referendum, we don't get a lot of people out to vote, and this may be even less because of the amount, but anybody in town can vote on this. Is there a required number of voters that are necessary to have this pass, or is it just if 15 people voted and 12 of them said yes, and the other said no, it goes, or is there any other requirement on the referendum?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it's just a majority vote.
And since it's 1 week from today, the referendum, what kind of information's going out? Are we sending information to users or other than our social media announcements?
So we're mentioning it at Board of Selectmen meetings where we've advertised it a little bit. We've put it on social media. It's been on the website. We haven't done any mailings. We've really just kind of relied on, kind of the social media thing. It's about the only thing that seems to get the word out.
That doesn't bring a lot of people even to a budget.
Yeah,
And there'll be less that'll be interested in this.
you're not wrong about that.
So there's no, as you know, no minimum requirement. 10 people could vote, and that's it. It's okay.
As far as I know.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Any other questions? I guess not.
Thank you, Jim. Seeing no more questions, pursuant to sections 305, 313, 916, and 1001 of the town charter, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting to referendum on Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. at Town Hall. Can we, all in favor? Unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you.
How will the voting be done, Glenn? Will people just be able to walk in, or is there going to be a separate table for doing it, or is it going to be in your office? How's that voting going to be done?
The registrar of voters is handling that. So I think they will either be set up in their office, they may be in here, I'm not sure, we'll have to get that information out to you. They handle the vote.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.